Welcome back, everybody, to second plenary discussion for today. This time focused on emergency basic income and that question of, is it an opportunity or a distraction from the main game of achieving a permanent universal basic income in a particular country or all around the world. I did want to start the session by, on behalf of the conference organisers, by acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded lands and to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet, to say that we pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So I just want to say a very quick thank you, mainly to Jürgen de Visbala, who will be familiar to many of you. And if you're new to the basic income movement, you should read some stuff by Jürgen. And Jürgen is really the key person who put together this fantastic panel of international speakers to discuss today's topic. We were hoping that this would be a live discussion, but with 15 different time zones, it became a little bit difficult, and we had to settle for this recorded discussion moderated by the excellent Jamie Cooke, who, again, those of you who've been around for a while will know the Glaswegian. So we will have the recorded discussion and debate among these five. It goes for around an hour, just over an hour, and then we'll have 20-25 minutes for discussion here. So please do think about what you can contribute to this discussion, this overarching question, and maybe some reflection on the pandemic experience in Australia or whatever country you have spent time in through the pandemic, and the sort of similarities and differences that you've observed in relation to this idea of an emergency basic income that we saw in different incarnations around the world. So on that note, I will just move out of the way and let you enjoy this panel discussion. Probably should have said my name is Troy Henderson. I'm from the Australian Basic Income Lab and the University of Sydney. Hello.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual session contributing to the 2022 Basic Income World Congress in Brisbane, Australia. Sadly, we can't be there with you in person today, but we've recorded this session to hopefully provoke some debate, discussion, and reflections on what we've seen taking place over the last few years. My name is Jamie Cooke. I work for an organisation called the RSA, an international think and do tank. And I've been very involved in the basic income discussions in my own country of Scotland and elsewhere around the world over the last few years. And indeed was lucky enough to be part of the organising committee for last year's BN Congress, which was in Glasgow, but sadly online. So we're sending congratulations and best wishes to our Australian friends as they deliver this year's Congress. Our session today is going to be looking at the idea of an emergency basic income. There's no doubting that over the last few years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a variety of responses around the world, looking at how cash, how money can make an impact in people's lives as they deal with this unprecedented crisis in many different countries. And so today, bringing in expertise from a range of different organisations and contexts, we're going to start to explore what that's looked like in practice, some of the impacts, positive, negative, perhaps, that have taken place, and indeed what that might mean for the future discussion around the basic income in different parts of the world. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of highly experienced expertise and colleagues. So we have Ugo Gentilini, Global Lead for Social Assistance at the World Bank, Claudia Robles, Social Affairs Officer in the Social Development Division at CEPAL, Ian Orton, Social Protection Policy Officer at the ILO, Francesca Bastagli, Director of Programme Equity and Social Policy at the ODI, and Louise Haagh, Professor of Politics at York University and former Chair of BN. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. The structure for today is that each of our panelists are going to give us an initial presentation of up to 5 minutes, sharing some of their thoughts and reflections on what we can expect from an emergency basic income. And then we'll take about half an hour or so to hopefully unpack some of those ideas and debate with each other some of the issues before we hand over to Troy in Brisbane to continue the discussion in person amongst yourselves. So I hope you find tonight's event fascinating, as I'm sure we are all going to. And without further ado, I will pass over to Ugo to share his thoughts.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a great pleasure to join you and this great panel of experts and colleagues. And as you just said, I think COVID-19 has marked really a historical scale up of cash transfers worldwide. We estimated that about 1.3 billion people were covered by cash during 2020 and 2021, or 17% of the world's population, and an additional 566 million individuals are now reached by cash transfers as part of inflation-related responses. And I think among those global responses, we witnessed something extraordinary. If only 2 countries did have an emergency basic income, or EBI, during the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, 13 countries and territories resorted to an EBI recently. 11 during the pandemic, and other 2 are using it now against inflation. So what are we learning from those experiences, especially during COVID-19? I would suggest that at least 4 lessons stand out. The first lesson is that there is a convergence between fiscal and monetary policy. Not only governments with their fiscal policies, but also central banks with their unconventional monetary policies are using cash, including because cash transfers can, under certain conditions, offer the potential for economic multipliers. But on this issue, emerging results seem a little underwhelming. 60 to 90% of transfers were not consumed, but saved or used for debt repayment. And hence the economic stimulus may have been a relatively modest power relative to initial expectations. The second lesson is that implementing an EBI is probably simpler than some targeted intervention, but it's not simple per se. In fact, practical delivery performance has been mixed, even in high-income countries. For example, in Japan, after 20 days from the announcement of the national EBI, 80% of local governments had not yet distributed the cash due to administrative issues. In South Korea, instead, more than 80% of households did get the payment over the initial 3 weeks period or so. The third lesson is that EBI programs were underpinned by intense and evolving political economy and societal debates in ways that influenced and altered decision-making about program design. For example, in Japan, again, the decision was initially to have a targeted program reaching 13 million households, which was then changed in favor of a one-off universal payment after several political negotiations. In South Korea, there were 5 cycles of payments. The first 4 were universal, and the 5th was eventually targeted to 88% of the population, so still large scale, but somewhat targeted. And in Singapore and Hong Kong, the first payment was provided in cash, the subsequent ones as vouchers. And in Singapore, transfers were not uniform, but pegged on income. So we have seen EBIs of different forms, and some design compromises were shaped by various political and societal forces over time and space. Finally, my 4th lesson is on financing. 11 out of the 13 EBI programs that we reviewed were in high or upper middle income countries and known in low income settings. They were funded via deficit financing bonds, or spending restructuring, or allocating revenues, surpluses, or drawing from fiscal reserves. None of these approaches might be considered as particularly sustainable, although it's understandable that the urgency and unpredictability of COVID might have led to dealing with it in whatever it takes terms. But if COVID was unpredictable, future pandemic might not. This speaks, I believe, to a need to better prepare social protection systems to future crises, including by connecting early warning systems, scale-up decisions, and risk financing strategies. Thank you, Jamie.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Really great starting point and that reflection on the different approaches that have been taken in different contexts. Claudia, I'll hand over to you now to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And the first thing I would like to say is a big thank you for this invitation. It's an honor to be here with you and the colleagues. Thank you very much for that. I will start by sharing some brief reflections based on the work and analysis that we have developed at the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, during the pandemic. Well, first of all, as you may be aware of, the pandemic has had serious economic and social impacts in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the recovery is still far from the horizon, with the region confronting weak economic growth and uncertainty, slow job creation, along with strong inflationary pressures. Social protection gaps and inequalities were a structural factor in the region previous to the pandemic. In 2018, a third of households with children and adolescents lacked social protection coverage of any sort. In 2020, we estimated that 1 in every 2 children and adolescents were in income poverty, for instance. Latin America and the Caribbean has the highest number of reported COVID-19 deaths of any region in the world. It accumulated excess deaths double the excess mortality in Europe, for instance, and it has been higher in countries with higher labor informality and poverty rates. Despite its relevance, emergency social protection measures that were implemented have been quite insufficient to fully confront the impacts of the pandemic. Between March 2020 and February 2022, we have estimated that 33 countries have implemented 4,078 emergency social protection measures, focusing on vulnerable households, including cuts transfers, transfers in kind, access to basic services, and measures aimed at reducing household expenses. Cuts transfers, and in particular new cuts transfers, represented 34% of these total measures implemented, which is quite salient. Coverage has reached half of the total population in 2020 and 47% in 2021, but sufficiency was quite low. Estimating the higher coverage program in 16 countries, we found that only in 6 of 16 countries, larger transfers were above the extreme poverty line, and only in 1 country, Chile, the amount of the transfers surpassed the poverty line throughout the whole period of the pandemic up to now. Measures contributed to mitigating poverty and extreme poverty by 1.8 and 2.9 percentage points, respectively. Yet in 2021, we have estimated that poverty rate reached 32.1% of the population. So what can we learn from this experience from the perspective of the discussion of an emergency basic income? In the first place, the experience of the region has been quite diverse and has not properly implemented this emergency basic income on a regular basis. Some countries established measures of a larger duration, but in other cases, responses have been rather ad hoc and short-termed. Based on the lessons learned from the region and its long-lasting well-being losses, countries of the region need to consider urgent steps toward creating an emergency basic income as a stable policy to confront disasters which are increasingly recurrent. We have been working quite a lot on costing this and also on coverage, and we foreseeing different options. Advancing towards an emergency basic income can be done based on the institutionalization of some of the measures through a process of learning and impact evaluation. And we should also overstate that flexibility and innovation has been quite important in the region. And it has to be considered that these measures have to be connected to disaster risk management policies and avoid fragmentation and duplication of efforts, as we are somehow witnessing these days with the new crisis due to the rises in food and energy prices. Incorporating these transfers into more robust social information systems and pre-existing social registers is fundamental, and we need to strengthen and improve social institutional frameworks as a key task for our region. As the pandemic clearly showed, as part of the making of a welfare state, it is essential advancing towards mechanisms that can implement a permanent income guarantee of some sort. There are many options, and I'm sure we will be discussing those now. And we have also stated that establishing, for instance, a universal transfer for children could be considered a relevant stepping stone, for instance, towards a universal basic income or other sorts of income guarantee. Either an EB or an ABI or a permanent income guarantee are insufficient on their own to contain the full impacts. So we have stressed the need to advance towards creating welfare states based on social rights. The expansion of universal access to quality social service is fundamental, and all of these will necessarily involve advancing towards a social, fiscal, and intergenerational pact at which collective bases are set for shared agreements on how to secure each person access to a level of well-being and advance towards sustainable development with equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Fantastic. Ian, we'll pass over to you now.
Hey, thank you, and thank you to Jamie and everybody for the opportunity to give some reflections. So I try to give my reflections by posing two questions which I attempt to answer. And question one, it would be, is there a correlation between the level of appeal of EBI and how robust or shoddy or underdeveloped a country's social protection system is? And is more societal interest in EBI indicative of where there is greatest need to build more comprehensive systems? My quick answer is yes, probably there is a correlation, but let me explain my workings a little bit more. So I think, as Ugo mentioned, the pandemic functioned as a stress test that illuminated the large gaps in country social protection provision, and where these gaps were largest, EBI discussions probably made more sense as a policy consideration. The crisis revealed these massive social protection gaps, and that half the world's population, so 4.1 billion people, had no social protection at all. And this became especially pertinent for the 2 billion informal economy workers that are not covered by social insurance or tax finance social assistance either, and their situation became very visible. But also the pandemic highlighted these gaps in specific parts of the social protection system, so particularly unemployment insurance or sickness benefits, which were really key to slowing the disease transmission and allowing people to quarantine without posing a risk to other people. I think it's fair to say that a clear bright spot in the pandemic has been the amazing response that was evident in the unprecedented social protection response with the many thousands of measures that were adopted. And while these extra measures were incredibly useful, I think it's fair to say that they also illuminated the quality and adequacy of social protection gaps that need to be closed. But nonetheless, without these massive responses, the human and socio-economic toll would have been much, much worse. I also realize this is a bit binary, but I think that countries that already had strong social protection systems in place were able to use them to guarantee access to healthcare, ensure income security, and protect jobs. And in these contexts, EBI probably had less appeal or less exposure as a concept. And the converse is true for countries with weak systems that really lacked the ability to respond quickly or couldn't mobilize the necessary support at scale. I think going forward, that in the context of high-income countries, EBI is likely to be considered as this kind of gap plugger and this all-rounder that probably resonates more in, say, your Anglo-Saxon welfare regimes, to use the Esping-Anderson typology, given their propensity for more commodified provision of social protection rights. So I think, yeah, EBI would be more alluring in these contexts where there's large coverage gaps, higher and kind of Kafkaesque conditionality, higher transaction costs, more exclusionary paternalism and means testing. So I think it would be more attractive in situations where social protection is more commodified, and the appeal is less in countries where entitlements are less decommodified, more decommodified and easily accessible and adequate and comprehensive. So I suspect the future discussion on EBI will be in contexts where there is no social protection or limited social protection as a possible big solution, and in more advanced welfare systems as a fixer and gap plugger. I think my concern would be that if EBI is used in countries with limited provision, what will this say about the chances of institutionalizing an EBI in a more permanent way to build systems? And elsewhere, I wonder whether there is a risk that EBI could be used for policy retrogression in context of fiscal consolidation. And there are concerns about UBI and EBI that it could be promoted to replace contributory social security systems that offer higher levels of protection. So my speculative hunch is that in liberal, rudimentary welfare states with weak public support for redistribution and solidarity, EBIs may take a role as a temporary stopgap solution, but they're unlikely to move into a more permanent fixture of a welfare system unless there are like really radical changes ahead. What would be most useful if there was a genuine society-wide EBI that lasted a year and a half or 2 years, where we could actually see these things play out as a national policy experiment. And I think we'd learn a lot more about that, because otherwise we're just left to considering these 5-month or 2-month kind of examples, which don't tell us as much as I think we could learn. And finally, just to give my institutional viewpoint here, I think any country that wishes to pursue an EBI would do well to pay attention to the ILO's international labour standards to ensure that they guarantee minimum standards and there are grievance mechanisms and that the benefits are adequate. So I will leave it there as my initial thoughts on EBI. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian, for that provocation. Francesca, we'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, everyone. Great to be on the panel. Following on from what the previous speakers have said, I think, so what we've seen in response to COVID, or anyway, since the onset of COVID, is this unprecedented reliance on cash transfers in various forms, but essentially, in many contexts, a temporary expansion of reliance on income support, including to previously excluded groups, and sometimes in the form of emergency, what is referred to emergency basic incomes. And we know that this can be an EBI or quasi-EBI, anyway, these scale-ups of cash transfers can be a very effective crisis response mechanisms. And we've learned and we've heard even from the previous speakers examples of what is it and what features about this EBI or EBI type schemes allows them to be effective crisis response mechanisms. One of these features is concerns the pre-crisis policy infrastructure. So where there are basic income or basic income type schemes in place, governments do have options in terms of scale up that can be, they're not necessarily that way, but can be comparatively easier to scale up. So even if we don't have a basic income, we know, plenty of examples of countries that have, for instance, universal child benefits or grants that were able to comparatively speedily increase the value of transfers fairly automatically. So we know that there is that relationship. We also know, of course, that features such as the value of the transfers, their duration, and all of that then matter to the effectiveness of this types of scheme in countering the effects of the crisis. And that's all very well. A separate question concerns what longer term implications EBIs in the context of COVID might have for income support schemes and a potential shift towards more basic income or basic income type schemes as we go forward. And I have a couple of points that I'd like to raise here. The first concerns a potential role of the COVID EBI and broader response in terms of cash transfers in supporting a potential shift in public attitudes and perceptions. And this has partly been already brought up. But I think what's very clear is that the COVID pandemic and the pandemic response raised an awareness of the need to improve income security for the population at large, right? As we've heard, it really, the pandemic shed a light on the gaps, the inequities of existing social protection and income support systems. And this awareness has been particularly acute, I think, with respect to population groups that were in many countries commonly excluded from existing income support schemes, right? So these included people that are able to work or people that are working that were intentionally excluded from existing, certainly from, well, cash transfers, whether social assistance or social social insurance schemes in many countries. Part of the reason for their exclusion in existing schemes pre-COVID is the result of a perception or misperception in many countries that these are people that are undeserving or less deserving or not needy or less needy. And the COVID crisis, of course, brought to light that actually these are individuals or families that are in need, particularly in crises such as this one. And so there is a question as to has have the adjustments that were made and the EBI or sort of equivalent similar adjustments that were made since the onset of COVID that have in many ways provided a proof of concept in terms of the ways in which a cash transfer can be expanded and extended to these to cover some of these gaps in inequities, have they supported a shift in attitudes? And here the evidence is mixed. I mean, obviously, by the way, we're talking about a moving picture, but where we have public attitude surveys available, for instance, we see in some countries, I think, for instance, in the European public attitude surveys available, indeed, surveys that capture support for basic income schemes, indicating an initial increase, an apparent increase in support in such schemes, but then this sort of waning over time. And certainly, indeed, in work we've also done at ODI, where we've looked at in a more qualitative way at support for expanding transfers to previously excluded population groups. This seemed comparatively high in earlier phases of the crisis and then has declined, not everywhere, but in several contexts as this, particularly as economic setback and some of the fiscal pressures have mounted over time. So I think, yes, there's mixed evidence there as to whether this experience may have supported a shift in attitudes. A second question concerns the design and implementation adjustments that were adopted, of which, again, we've heard a couple of examples, and the innovations in terms of that have supported an expansion in cash and in some cases a move towards a temporary emergency basic income. Is there any, what is the evidence, or is there any suggestion that some of these might be here to stay or might influence policy design in the longer term? In terms of coverage, I mean, coming back to the expansion to workers that were previously excluded, I think, again, the evidence is mixed. I mean, where the adjustments were to measures that were already in place, most of these were temporary. They've already been reversed. And so this doesn't mean that in the future we won't see another expansion independently of a crisis, but the sense is that these were clearly temporary emergency measures. In many countries, governments explicitly decided and chose to set up these emergency transfers separately from existing minimum income schemes, which they could have adjusted, but they explicitly chose not to. I think, precisely, we know in some cases to avoid creating expectations or, making adjustments that were more longer term institutional adjustments. So the waiving of conditionalities, the weakening of certain means testing requirements often were applied to these separate sort of long-standing emergency transfers. Elsewhere, of course, we've seen remarkable steps forward being taken where minimum income schemes weren't in place. So with new schemes that were in many countries possibly already in the works, but being then adopted. But again, these are, in most cases, still we're talking minimum income, so means tested, and in many cases conditional schemes. And I'm thinking, again, if you take the European experience, all 4 Southern European countries that historically have not had minimum income scheme in place, we've seen them adopt and expand them in the recent years, and it's partly in relation to the COVID crisis. But also, I think it's just worth mentioning here important examples of where governments decided to expand, and this comes back also to partly the public attitudes point, where they did decide to rely on an expansion of existing minimum income type schemes that were comparatively generous. And I'm thinking of the US extended child tax credit, where, of course, the extension was made and was then discontinued. So where there was a potential and there was a discussion of its potential continuation, this was perhaps one of the most important and effective income transfer tax credit adjustments that the Biden administration made, and as is well known and well documented, there was a decision not to continue it, in part as a result also of polling that I think that indicated that there was a preference in the public for investments in Medicare, housing, and other factors, so not in that type of, direct income support programs. A quick note here, that again on policy design, is around the role of social insurance. Of course, there's all the more assistance type movements that are you might directly want to link to a wider basic income conversation. But of course, some of the more interesting innovations and expansions was through the social insurance contributory branch. And I'm thinking of important examples in South Africa, Jordan. And this brings me to the point, perhaps the final point, on what the EBI experience might hold for longer term considerations, which is that I think it does highlight the point that any conversation on BI, also basic income going forward does need to be had as part of income support as a whole system, and not just a sort of a standalone program. Even though in principle we might think of it that way, you do need to bring in and be aware of the idea that some income support schemes will be achieved, and minimum income guarantees will be achieved through a combination of measures. And the COVID experience highlights this very clearly. It also highlights the point that we need to take the wider social protection system into account. As Ian alluded, in some countries where we did see impressive, yes, perhaps temporary expansions in cash transfers, in some cases we see there, these expansions have partly grown over and are possibly partly here to stay. But these have been accompanied in some cases with continued and ongoing disinvestments in wider social services, and this is obviously concerning. And I think just a final point in closure, perhaps a word of warning on the use of the concept of EBI. I mean, I think we're all in agreement to understand what we mean by EBI here, but of course, the focus in this context tends to be on emergency, short-term, on poverty relief, which of course can be, and is one of the functions of social protection and basic income schemes. But there is a risk, and given the title of the session talks about opportunities or distraction, I mean, there is a risk also that there's an emphasis, or the emphasis falls very much on crisis response, which is, as I say, an important objective, but equally or even more important remain the objectives of income and consumption smoothing over the lifetime, not just vertical redistribution, but also horizontal redistribution. And so let's just be clear, even as we talk EBI and as we talk and worry about future crises to come, that we don't take our feet off the pedal, of the gas in terms of the wider objectives of policy and wider basic income. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca. Now, I'm sure we can unpack some of those in a bit more detail in a minute. Come to our final contribution from Louise, and then we'll open up to the panel to discuss. So, Louise, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Hello?
Yep, we can hear you. Great.
Okay, good. Sorry, because I wasn't sure. Yeah, so thank you for the other great contributions, and I agree with a lot of the points that have been made. To be more provocative, I think what COVID showed us is that the systems that were already doing well managed to do better, and the systems that were not doing well in terms of funding in place for social protection had to rely on temporary measures that needed to be shut down, and the cost of that increase followed by that shutdown has been very large financially, in terms of ongoing or soon to emerge austerity in many of these countries, including Britain, of course, but also in terms of public attitudes, and maybe even cost to the left. Look at what's happened in Chile very recently, and whilst we cannot draw a direct correlation between the end of all of the COVID emergency schemes in Chile and the result of the recent referendum, there has been, through opinion polls, very clear indications that there has been a very determined rise in disapproval of the new government due to the end of the COVID measures. And of course, the new government sponsored the recent constitutional referendum. So I think there are some rather somber lessons there in terms of what really matters, has mattered during COVID, which is really what was in place before the crisis having dictated the outcome or the nature of responses to those crises. But I want to question the question really when we look at the question of emergency basic income scheme, so-called, and I wonder whether we ought to go wider to ask whether we can trust the reasons why we are talking about, why the governments are apparently more interested in universalism today. Because I think my first point is that I think we do appear to be moving in a direction that's very different from the past, which at the level of public policy or proclamations by global development institutions points in the direction of, if not a basic income, a new form of universality that somehow speaks potentially to a basic income. So there is a new readiness of states to intervene on a fairly grand scale, which is, differently orientated from the 2008 crisis, where we're talking about bank bailouts. Now we have the willingness of governments, we have the COVID crisis, but we have the more recent energy crisis as well, of governments to intervene on a grand scale. And not only that, to do so in a new, I think, universal direction that has contrasted with the past. So in the case of Britain, of course, there wasn't a large cash grant scheme as such as in the United States. There was more of an emphasis on upholding jobs, protect furlough, and protect business, which is not a bad thing itself. There was an increase in the existing universal credit income support scheme for the poorest of £20 per week, which of course again was very decidedly withdrawn. Even though I think even in this case, there was, in the British case, where you didn't have a large scale cash to individual scheme, you did have some sort of recognition that income assistance ought to reach at all levels of society. And that in turn, I think, may have paved the way, or at least can be seen as parallel to what we've seen more recently in the energy crisis debate in Britain, where I was quite surprised when the now former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, he was the first to come out and say that he wanted to implement not only a targeted form of support for households, to the poorest households, but a universal emergency credit, effectively to all households, £400, with an additional, much larger top up for the poorest. And then that was followed then by a tussle during the ensuing Tory leadership election between himself and the other candidate, Liz Truss, where they both wanted to prove that they were against universality and they were going to target scarce public resources to the very poorest. But lo and behold, as soon as Liz Truss won the election, the first thing she did was to announce a new universal scheme, and in fact, universal freeze on energy bills, which would be picked up by the taxpayer. So a new universal idea, I think, that is in some ways unprecedented for the debate in Britain, which in policy, the policy trend in Britain, which has been towards ever greater means testing, including, of course, of child benefits effectively since 2014. So my question is, how unique is this? How extraordinary is this? And my answer is, I don't actually think it is that it's extraordinary or unique, and there's something somewhat more sinister behind this new trend, which I see as a parallel to some extent to the interest in large-scale emergency bailouts during COVID in the form of cash grants. I think what we have seen in Britain is part of a trend of other large-scale rescue packages that have become more universal and focused on ordinary citizens, as I said before. But second, I think that this new trend is actually the sign of a much more general and a greater failure of public finance, of social security funding, of social saving in society, and of course of public governance of the economy, and failings that I see as dynamically and inextricably tied to the prevailing growth model, linked with the trend of competition for global finance, premised on low tax and mobile labor. And this leads to my second point, which I'll frame then with the question whether we're really seeing a potential transition to a real universalism, albeit slowly, one that is stable, one that's institutionalized. Have we seen a real shift in thinking behind these large-scale bailouts and the seeming new resort to universalism? And I think the reason is the answer to that, both questions, is absolutely not. And the reasons, more than the fact, is why we should be worried. And I think we need to appraise how this tendency, this increasing tendency to large-scale bailouts across a range of different crises. I think the pandemic is, we can no longer say that the pandemic is an exception. It was an externally imposed event that it required a large bailout. I think what's been happening is that the growth model we have been pursuing, the nature of global interdependence, the reliance of low tax competition is really driving a squeeze on public finances and of the state, of social protection funding across the world, which and social savings in society across the world, which is in turn producing a need for large-scale bailouts that cannot be sustained, and that will inevitably be followed by austerity. And of course, we see that in Britain. The first thing that, or the next thing that Liz Truss announced was that it would be the taxpayer who would be picking up the bill for the energy price freeze, not a windfall. She would not introduce a windfall tax on energy companies because she said this would deter inward investment to Britain at a moment when the growth model relied on it. So there we have it, a very direct connection between the need, and I think in an imposed need on the state to perform through these universal bailouts, whether in terms of COVID responses or now the energy crisis, followed then by a huge and very painful adjustment in the public finances. And one of the things I think is very interesting here is how, if we look at public finance trends, in Britain, for example, we've seen a leveling off of, or rather a stagnant level of tax in GDP, which compares, if you look at the Nordic countries, with a rising, a very dominant rising trend in public finance over the last half a century. That Britain has been stagnant on some measures. I was just looking. Britain's tax in GDP was 26.4% in June 2022. It's just been recently falling, of course, according to some comparative international data. And at this trend, if we follow this trend, what it will mean is that Britain will be collecting less tax in GDP than South Korea, historically a low tax state, which is now collecting tax at 28% of GDP, a tax base which has grown exponentially in the last 30 years. And South Korea could soon be witnessing a higher tax intake, therefore, than Britain, the historic so-called first welfare state. In Chile, of course, already with a much lower tax intake than South Korea, tax now stands at 19% of GDP. And I just referred to the fact that the quite generous and quite successful in many ways cash grant schemes in Chile was gradually withdrawn. And also, when it comes, it's important to mention when it comes to Chile, the influence or the role of the pension scheme, the use of early withdrawals from the privatized pension system, the private pension accounts played in the bailout, which again, of course,
Jumping
it can only,
Louise, if we could kind of move towards
okay,
up for some discussion.
has to be followed by, sorry, it comes at the back of less savings in retirement. So we see a huge contradiction, is essentially my point, between this apparent commitment to universalism and the reality that lies behind it, which is that there isn't the capacity for it. And I think this is a worrying trend, and what we should be focusing on, perhaps the lessons that we ought to take are from the smaller countries that have built public capacity. And I mentioned South Korea. I could say more about South Korea, but South Korea innovated quite spectacularly along a range of measures during the COVID pandemic. It not only used its existing public savings and mixed public-private savings systems to fund the emergency measures during COVID, but it also innovated and expanded those systems towards new groups in a quite spectacular way. And I could give examples from other countries, the existing systems of socially mobilized savings. My point being that what we should focus on are these systems of socially mobilized savings within countries, because it's those systems that are going to build sustainable social protection and that are going to create a foundation for transition when it's plausible to envisage one to a universal basic income.
Excellent. So I think we now have a chance to unpack a lot. We've had a lot shared there. I think really those themes of how much the existing structures played a role in the responses that we saw and how we're starting to come out of this. I often feel that the pandemic, very few of the major issues we saw were new challenges. They were the existing ones, as we heard, with light shone upon them, that we couldn't avoid them. But also, I think all of you touching on the fact that there's been very different responses in different parts of the world and opportunities within that. So I just wanted to open up first to the panel to see if there were any reflections or comments or challenges that had particularly come up for you in the other contributions that we'd heard today. Just if anyone had any initial thoughts that they wanted to share. Ian?
Yeah, an interesting discussion that would be good to clarify is what are we actually talking about when we say EBI? Is it a 5-month thing? Is it a very short cash transfer, or is it a year and a half or 2 years? And then this discussion of universalism, I'm interested to know, is EBI driving universalism, or is it already riding a wave of potential universalism that's been unleashed by other forces? And also want to make the point that the focus on EBI seems to me to mark quite a significant ontological shift in classical UBI from being a permanent fixture of the life course to perhaps becoming this tool just for crisis management and fire brigade response. And is that a concern for the UBI community? Should we be concerned about this kind of movement of UBI to EBI as the most popular concept?
Thanks, Ian. So yes, a few challenges for us there. What is the EBI? That's been touched on by a few people already. That connection into the universalism that Louise flagged up, and I think really one of those questions I wanted to explore was that relationship between EBI and UBI, and is this a positive? Is this a step in the right direction, or actually could this be a diversion or a hindrance to us actually developing that wider delivery of policy? So I think taking that concept of the definition of EBI, we've all used it today in terms of our discussions. Some of those characteristics perhaps that come out most strongly about it, have you, from your own experiences, have you seen, is there a consistent way that policymakers are using an EBI, or is it very much varying depending on political context and national context? You go.
Now this, I concur with Ian. It's a really great discussion. What is interesting about EBIs these days is that they have basically been used as kind of on and off interventions. So these are either a one-off payment or up to 5 payments. That's what we have seen so far. They are concentrated on the top tier of the income distribution across countries. So as I mentioned, we haven't seen any of these sort of policies in low-income countries. And it's fascinating. There's something about East Asia. You're having the Congress in Australia. So Australia was one of the 2 countries that did have this policy back in 2009. Now we see Tuvalu, East Timor, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Mongolia. So there is something about the region where this seems to be a policy that is more popular than elsewhere in the world. So I would raise the question why that's the case. Spoiler, we have a paper about it coming up in a few weeks. But it's I think it's fascinating, and I wonder if that also might relate to previous experiences with health-related crisis. And we are already in the post-COVID world. Sometimes there is a huge shock You have time to reflect. What are we learning? There are months, if not years, before the next crisis. This is not the case nowadays. Immediately, we went into another crisis while COVID is still around. And one big shift that we have seen in the current responses to inflation is that countries are widely resorting back to subsidies as opposed to social assistance. That seems in direct contradiction to some of the things and learning that are emerging from the COVID response. Another big question there, why is that the case? We have a tracker coming up, the third version, where we look at over 600 of those interventions, trying to unbundle the question, but it is something somewhat in contradiction with what we have seen earlier.
Thanks, Hugo. Ian, and then Louise, and then Claudia.
Yeah, just very quickly, when I first joined UBI discussions in the early 2000s, I don't remember emergency basic income being spoke about too much. There were two scenarios where it was spoken about, and this was as a stability grant for reconstruction, stability grant for post-debacle Iraq to be paid for 2 years, right? And the second one, I think, was after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, 2004, 2003. But these were put forward by some of the more prominent members of BN as like at least a 2-year thing to fully transition. And now we're talking about a much shorter time horizon. So that I find that interesting. And then people like yourself, Jamie, and other colleagues like Jürgen have proposed it for 1.5 years, 2 years, right? So there seems to be, that's the ideal type of EBI. So that would be my one take on duration.
Thanks, Ian. Louise.
Well, I think basic income advocates have always, or many basic income advocates have been opportunists, crisis and opportunity, and the discourse, the narrative has been powered by crisis from its very inception. So this is to me not a surprise, but I do think the concept is problematic. I think it's a red herring in many ways, and I'm not sure, but in some ways I prefer a different term. If we could come up with a different term, emergency cash programs or emergency cash payments, just to underline the difference, because I think there is confusion. I mean, I know what the difference is. We know in the room what the difference is, but I think in the public domain, there is a lot of confusion about whether now basic income is essentially an emergency stopgap policy tool. And of course, in order for real basic income to be sustainable, it has to be funded, and that means it has to be institutionalized, and that means that we have to realize that it connects to a lot of other things. It connects to formalization of the labor market. Of course, I mean, if we look at the countries that can fund the universal basic income, it is countries that have very high level of formalization of work. And so these things are interconnected, and I think that we get away from the sense in which they're interconnected, too far away from that when we're talking about universal emergency basic incomes. Even while I'm sympathetic, of course, to the idea that it is an opportunity to make a case, I think maybe different terminologies going forward, it would not be a bad idea.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, and I know certainly we saw a lot, in the discussions during the pandemic where policies were implemented, and the media reports were, Spain has introduced a basic income. Well, actually, no, it's a targeted piece. So I think, as you say, that clarity of language, of usage, of long-term versus short-term interaction, I think is critical. Claudia.
Thank you very much. I think many interesting points have been raised, and well, just to provide some points on the discussion so far. Regarding emergency basic income, I think, yes, there is this necessity to clarify better what we should understand by it. What we have largely in the region is an experience with measures of cash transfers, as Louise just said, and in some respects, in order to advance towards a basic income, really, or emergency basic income, as discussion on the levels and the amounts should be brought forward as I just pointed out about the insufficiency of most of these cash transfers. In terms of the duration, we see a very heterogeneous situation. For instance, most of the measures and the cash transfers introduced during the pandemic, they have a duration of less than 3 months, but there are many other examples where payments have been made up to 20 times or 22 times, and there's a large different examples both in the Latin American region and the Caribbean region on that, and we should document more, extract more regions, systematize more that information and the lessons learned, and also exchange among regions. I think that's very crucial. On the other hand, I think the point that Ian Orton raised concerning the need to understand that, and also, well, all of you have named it, we need to move forward to really universal, integrative, comprehensive, sustainable, and resilient social protection systems. We try to advocate that always, and that includes, of course, reaching a greater articulation between the non-contributive and the contributory component of social protection. Also, care policies and labor regulation policies are crucial, and we need to understand that as a whole. I share also the same concerns that Ian Orton has mentioned about this replacement of social security in some debates. I think that's not the way forward at all. But we need to secure incomes, where, especially at times of crisis, we have seen it so desperately here, because half of our occupied population is in informal labor. But we need to also extract lessons. So those measures that manage to expand social security or even articulate non-contributory and contributory measures are examples of how we can move forward toward this building of universal social protection systems. Yes, I would say that concerning this relationship between an EBA and universal basic income, I think we have learned a lot about the imperative constraints and challenges that we have in the region, also political economy issues, and the need to sustain a social pact and an intergenerational pact and a fiscal pact, which is so urgent and necessary for our region and the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claudia. That's excellent. Francesca, I just want to check whether you want to come in at all with any points.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just, on building on what's been said, essentially, is also the financing angle. Of course, it's been touched upon, but part of the issue here, and I think Louise touched on it very clearly, actually, is that in the ways universalism, or the term, is being thrown around or increasingly relied on by by organizations, by politicians, and so on, tends to refer to the spending side of things, and then within it there are various and on coverage aspects. But of course, it has to bring in everything else as well, including the financing side. And unfortunately, and that's where also the question about how was the COVID response financed? And as we think about how EBI in the COVID response might be shaping future financing of income support mechanisms going forward, or what are the lessons emerging, what is key is to monitor and observe, de facto, what, beyond the sort of lingo or rhetoric, what are governments doing here? And I think, we did see, yes, of course, some of these schemes, these temporary schemes, were in the short term funded through reallocations, some of them, by the way, quite questionable, or anyway, that had, raised major sustainability and equity concerns, some of them through government borrowing, but also there were interesting discussions around one-off wealth taxes. And I think so any conversation going forward around this question, both of the emergency financing, but also more generally about, the financing over time of a permanent, more inclusive and sustainable income support system, needs to consider financing and taxation in particular, that includes progressive income taxes, but also corporate taxes, property taxes, wealth taxes that may have been unpopular, or maybe not unpopular, but simply governments have tended to steer clear of. And yeah, we need to be hearing more of that, because if you do, they've come up. They came up in the G7. I mean, they come up, and we know there are initiatives around, for instance, the restructuring of the corporate tax system and so on. But that needs to be accelerated and implemented to ensure a fairer and more revenue to finance, because there is capability, right? I mean, what's so frustrating here is that it's not as if there isn't in the sense that, yes, revenue is plummeting, but that's partly a choice, right? I mean, it's not just the result of the economic crisis, and also the way, and of course it comes back to wider questions about how we raise revenue, how we manage a wider social contract. And just in closure, that brings me, yes, as well, back to the point of the EBI. And again, as I said earlier, a word of caution around how we use that word, that expression, because the very notion of emergency, in some sense, I mean, associating emergency with basic income, while I understand where it comes from and what is meant, is actually a distraction from, you know, some of the foundational principles of the basic income, and certainly a universal basic income. Because the point is, it's a regular payment and it's part of a wider social system that has a strong social contract and so forth, and that sort of gets lost once the word emergency is brought in, which is an important function of social protection and income support schemes, but it's frankly only one of them. And until we make sure we incorporate all the other functions as well, that there is a risk that the conversation gets derailed, and frankly that governments also partly take advantage of that to avoid more structural foundational reforms.
Fantastic, thank you. Louise, I think
yeah, I think it's important to recognize that there are different levels at which this discussion of funding needs to take place, that it's not a question of trying to find some kind of global solution, nor alone, nor a national solution on its own, and that these discussions need to take place at both levels. I mean, at the global level, there is a need to talk about how do you tax the big corporates, how do you, maybe some sort of international levy on energy, I don't know, on the energy companies, those sort of discussions need to take place. But I think that's not to the exclusion of the national. And I think what's very interesting to see, for example, in the Danish case, which I follow quite closely, is how the way that Denmark relied on its existing systems, which in many ways are quite exclusive. If you look at the unemployment insurance system, it only pays out to contributors. So of course, contributors are the majority in Denmark. It has a very, very high contributory rate, and it's voluntary. It's a voluntary system. But during COVID, the system was actually reformed or extended. The payments were extended to those not in the system. So you had an extension of solidarity coming out of that contributory system. For me, it raises a wider point that I've made before, is that I think as basic income supporters, we should not be afraid of these old solidarity systems that are reliant on contributions and the old welfare models, because it is actually, if you look historically, it's through those models that more unconditional, not perfectly unconditional, but more unconditional and rights have emerged, and more extensive coverage has emerged. And through these means that discussions of basic income have been more realistic historically. Of course, the recent period is different because we are now in a neoliberal period where the discussion looks different. But it's very concerning, again, I come back to Denmark, how some basic income supporters have argued that in order to finance a basic income, the state should end its subsidy of the unemployment insurance system. Well, that subsidy is what ensures that system can cover the lowest paid. So you take that subsidy away, that system is effectively a private insurance system. So that's a real problem, and basic income supporters need to get their head around solidarity and the importance of solidarity for unconditional rights. These two things are actually complementary, and we've seen it play out during COVID, which I think is very interesting. So last point, I've just been asked by the biggest left party in Denmark, which has traditionally been really against basic income, like ferociously against, precisely because they're defending themselves against a libertarian argument that a basic income is, is different from solidarity, the old solidarity. And they've just been asked to speak at their annual meeting because they're going to have a vote on basic income. Now that's quite historic in Denmark, and I think one of the reasons why it's been brought to that level, the level of the national annual meeting, rather than just a little sectarian group within that party, is precisely because of the experience of the way that the solidarity system was extended to cover those funds were used by agreement, by tripartite agreement, to cover those not in the system. So that generated an interesting debate about potentially more universal measures.
Fantastic. Thank you, Louise. Sadly, we're hurtling towards the end of our time just now. So I'm going to pass over to Ian to put his hand up for a final comment. And then I'm afraid we'll need to pass over to our colleagues who we can't see just now sitting in Brisbane. So Ian, if you want to come on to your final point.
Yeah, it was really only a point on the back of Louise's point that the Danish unemployment insurance system was able to pay out these additional measures. And I think what's been lost in the capturing of these amazing emergency responses that happened was there were some 4,000 pre-existing legal statutory schemes that functioned as designed with no need to change things because they were already well set up, had sustainable financing. And we shouldn't get carried away with forgetting the silent majority of schemes that did as they were designed to in comprehensive welfare systems. And if you have a comprehensive welfare system, the need for emergency measures is much more reduced. I think sometimes we get carried away in the hyperbole of the response.
Fantastic, thank you. Could happily sit and listen to you all day, but unfortunately we do need to bring it to a close. But I think it shows us the importance of language, the importance of the structures and the processes. I know the conversation is going to continue in Australia now, building on what we've been discussing. I think for me, certainly we've only just started to scrape the surface of some key issues here. That idea of definition of the use of the word emergency. That risk that it poses of being solely attached to something like a pandemic, where are we looking at the emergency-based incomes in terms of climate change and the impacts taking place in other areas there? Does it stand as a barrier to progress with a wider basic income? Is it a step towards it? I think we've certainly heard certainly quite a few of the risks that I think the terminology can play in taking that forward. But also I think something around that idea of preparing for the future, getting ahead of crises that are going to come to us thick and fast, as Hugo pointed out earlier, and actually being prepared for those rather than seeing everything as a response to it. We're struck by Ian talking about the fire brigade response. I mean, it's interesting, certainly here in Scotland, that nowadays the fire brigades probably spend more time going out to people's houses to make sure that they have fire alarms and are taught fire safety to actually stop themselves having to be the fire brigade response. And that preventative rather than reactive element, I think, is critical. So I want to thank all of our panel tonight for their amazing contribution to Hugo, to Claudia, to Ian, to Francesca and Louise. Really appreciate your expertise, your provocations and your responses tonight. I think this is very much a conversation that needs to be continued and expanded. So we wish you all the best in Brisbane. I'll hand over to Troy now, who will take you into the next part of the conversation. But thank you for your listening and for your contributions, and we look forward to meeting up with you in future. Thank you.
There's a lot to listen to, and we did lose a few people along the way. But thanks for sticking with it, those of you who remain here. And it's a lot to digest. Speaking of digestion, Greg just told me that on the registration table at lunch, there will be directions about how to get to the dinner. So pick those up on the way out. But we do have about 20 minutes left for not questions. You don't need to ask me a question, but contributions that you might like to make from the floor. You've already got your hand up, so you go first, and then Tim. People online as well. I can see we still had a good chunk online who stuck with it. You can put questions through the Q&A portal, and Jem will let me know about those. But just we have this experience through the COVID-19 pandemic of these unparalleled fiscal interventions that centered heavily on cash transfers, as was talked about. Ben and Louise, myself, have talked about the Australian situation of being a natural experiment with a quasi-basic income. We saw similar things in the US and South Korea, as we heard yesterday, and also, in Canada as well, with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And I know some people have lived experience of the impact of receiving one of those benefits. But then, so there's that angle to the debate, but then also this broader point related to basic income. Do these types of emergency measures push us closer in particular ways to actually achieving a basic income in a particular country or region? Or are they short-term distractions that there's a lot of excitement for a period of time, and then there's a quick snapback as we saw in Australia, and momentum is lost. So I will go to you.
Can I use the mic?
Sure.
Okay. Hello. I'll be speaking tomorrow. My name's Kai. When we think about the emergency basic income, we can almost think of it a lot like unemployment, I think. And unemployment acts as an automatic stabilizer in the economy. When people become unemployed, it helps to provide them credit. So when the economy goes down, money is issued, recession spending goes up, and it's a stabilizer. So when we see demand push inflation or deflation start to occur, where people are spending less, I think we can sort of see the emergency UBI acting as a new form of stabilizer and thinking of it that way. So in regards to funding, I find that the debate a little, the thing is we can issue as much credit as we want into the economy. That's a quote from Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed. And I'm very interested in hearing about the move towards, because these economists, I'm from these economists, the move to perhaps issuing a part of our spending and our basic income as an asset, and instead of backing all of our spending through treasuries. That's something I'm not quite so decided yet on. So looking towards that in the future, along with this stabilization.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll go to Tim.
I'll come over here. Thanks very much. I think the thing that I wanted to pull out a little bit is the definitional question that was alluded to a fair bit. And I was, in the light of the conversation that you folks, Troy, Louise and others have been having about what we saw in Australia in response to the pandemic being pretty clearly an emergency basic income in so many ways, I was really struck that Ugo Gentilini was making the suggestion that the Kevin Rudd, Ken Henry payments in response to the financial crisis were an emergency basic income. I think that we should and particularly in terms of the impact on the debate, we should very, very clearly reject that. What we saw then was one-off payment followed by a second one-off payment. And there was no suggestion at any point along the way that it was at all about solidarity or all about poverty reduction or anything like that. Those payments were very deliberately about economic stimulation in the face of a financial crisis. It was never about poverty. It was about go and spend it, buy a new television at Harvey Norman. And so the idea that we should consider that as any form of basic income, I think we should absolutely reject, because that kind of thing does then turn around and become a very serious blocker to taking the conversation forward in any way. Whereas what you guys have identified in terms of what happened in 2020, to me that really does take the conversation forward, because it shows quite how much benefit it gave to so many people, and solidarity, the solidarity economy kind of approach to it that sits behind it is so crucial. So those are pretty stark ends of the spectrum, I guess, in a sense, in terms of that definitional question that was being alluded to. And yeah, I don't know, I'm sure there was a very broad spectrum between those two about what happened.
Thanks, Tim. Before I go to Ben, I thought, is there anyone who feels particularly strongly that the type of experience we saw in Australia with the doubling of unemployment assistance and the removal of conditionality for that relatively short period of time was, in no way useful in progressing the basic income debate? So.
Yeah, so I was on Job Seeker when that happened, and I think the main reason that more people got money is that the government couldn't afford for the general population to understand how cruel they were. Because if most people had to apply for Social Security and had to experience the conditions that those who ordinarily are in that situation have to deal with, we may have had a revolution. And we were under a Liberal Conservative government, so they doubled the payment for JobSeeker, so that those of us who were on JobSeeker suddenly felt rich and had nothing to worry about because we know how to live on a small amount of money. People who were out of work felt poor, felt hard done by, but at least they had some money to live on. So there was no political revolution and push. If people had had to wait, or if people had had to prove that they deserved support, we would have had some big changes. The first thing I saw in the press was, oh, all these people have lost their jobs and it's not their fault. As if the reason that all of us who were already on JobSeeker were on it because we were lazy and it was entirely our personal responsibility. That is the line that the government was continually pushing, even though there was 19 jobs per JobSeeker before COVID. So I think in Australia, it was a massively political choice. Fortunately, it didn't save the Liberal government and get them back in again. But that's what they were aiming for. It was not about poverty alleviation. It was about poverty avoidance and revolution avoidance.
Thanks a lot. Could we go to Ben next?
Thanks, Troy. Going after that's extraordinary. So, I think you're completely right, by the way, Jane. It partly came out, I think, in the conversation about this being something where welfare states were basically failed welfare states needed this thing because they had no other choice. While it was actually full functioning welfare states didn't engage very much. And I think on the emergency thing, we were just having that chat then about whether the language is useful. That the global definition of this is just completely different to our experience here. We're an outlier in Australia on how this worked. So yeah, any cash payment is more or less defined as an emergency basic income for the purposes of most of that conversation, which includes relatively small payments which only happen 2 or 3 times. Yeah. So even though ours is relatively short, but it's at the very long end of the international experience, which was, it went for 6-9 months, right? It didn't go for 3 payments. So I think that's one of the reasons why it is more useful. I agree the only reason it happened is because of a dramatic failure of the system. But I suppose in terms of the where do we go from here, the question that was opened up, I think a bit, for me there's one is that GFC payment from Rudd does seem to have led informed international practice, and particularly in our region. I think that's really interesting for us to think about. Not in the way that we necessarily want, but that's been really interesting. And if it's going to happen again, yes, we don't have it permanently, but if there's another crisis, it's going to be a whole series of crises probably confronting us, financial and ecological. Is there now a public expectation that governments have to do this? And how do we make sure that there is? Yeah, because I think that at least creates some degree of certainty. It's still not a basic income, and it's still not what we want. But I thought about more as the difference was between the GFC and this crisis was in the GFC they bailed out Wall Street using monetary policy, and this time they bailed out households to bail out Wall Street. But the cash didn't go straight to the businesses and to the bankers. The cash went via households, and that is really important. They still found a way to do that, mate. So I think that's one lesson. The other is, particularly in Australia, there was an enormous increase in the number of people who are on JobSeeker, not just because more people were unemployed, but because lots of people applied who ordinarily wouldn't have because of the immense stigma that has been built up around that program in Australia. So if you look at the numbers of people on JobSeeker now, they're at record high levels despite record low unemployment because of the wave of extra people who have come onto the payment and because most of the jobs are part-time and so people still qualify for the payment. And is there a political base there to mobilise against exactly the things that Jane was talking about the severe conditionality. Is there some political opportunity there? I suppose trying to say, what are the political opportunities out here? And they're the two that I heard might still be there.
Can I ask one question? Just quickly, we had a different kind of payment in New Zealand, but which was again a different kind of conditionality that benefited those that weren't ordinarily on the unemployment benefit. So others, the COVID unemployment, were treated with great preference. And one of those preferences was that people that were married or in a relationship in the nature of marriage could apply in their own right. And of course, that's one of the biggest problems with welfare systems like ours, is that we are seen as couples. And did that happen in Australia? Were people here allowed to apply for the COVID payment in their own right, regardless of relationship?
So what happened was that there was a very significant relaxation of the partner test. So sort of yes, but not quite in quite the same way. So the way it happens in Australia is that both people are able to access the payment, but they access it at a lower rate. So and that if you try to access the payment, there's a means test on your partner's income. Yeah. So that's similar, yeah. So that means test was radically reduced. So that meant that a whole bunch of people who ordinarily would have been excluded got it.
Ben, can we go to Jim next, who's just in front of you? And just one point where I'm not sure, I have to go back to Hugo's work to look at precisely how he defined emergency basic income, because he did only talk about 11 emergency basic incomes, and there were radically more than that in terms of the type of fiscal interventions that are similar to the crisis.
So some of the people in that, not all of them.
Yeah.
But some of them were clearly talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think you're right about the Rudd link of what you guys were saying. Jim.
I think the panelists had a very good point in trying to make us conscious of the language we're using and thinking about, universal basic income as at least a piece of a resilient, long-term, sustainably funded income support system. But the reality is we are dealing with emergencies or crises or whatever you want to label it. I mean, it was interesting, of course, as Ben was just mentioning, the 2008 crisis was, a crisis of the big financial globalized banks, right? So we bailed them out, and a few people in places like Australia got a stimulus check to try and boost the economy. We didn't get that in Canada. But COVID was clearly a global public health crisis. So households and individuals needed income, so they got these immediate payments. But I mean, we're facing lots of other crises and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future, right? War in Ukraine, rising authoritarianism. In particular, I think the ecological crises, plural. So for me, the question is, how do we kind of recalibrate our thinking in basic income to tie it to the need to move towards a steady state economy, a sort of social ecological transition to, and with the wealthy countries in particular, to draw down our rate of production and consumption, redistribute resources on a global level, and maybe it's good not to think about that as a crisis or an emergency. You just get into all this kind of conceptual imprecision and hyperbole, as the panelists were mentioning. But we didn't really talk about that in the panel. How do we tie this to kind of a green transition? I'm thinking about this kind of a new way of reproducing ourselves on this planet. So that's a big question, and I know we're out of time, but we can just throw that in there.
Thanks, Jim. Is anyone else maybe up the back that we haven't come to?
There's a question online, Troy.
So I got one question online.
There's another question online. It's from Otto Leto. I wonder if we'll ever go back to one.
Okay, we have a question from Otto Leto, who some of you may know. I wonder if we'll ever go back to non-crisis times, or so. Some crises like wars and pandemics are coming to an end. Others, I think, as Jim was saying, like global warming, automation, aging population, are likely to be long-lasting or never-ending. At least they will define our political debate for the next 50 to 100 years. What does this mean for the politics of basic income? Does this permanently blur the line between EBI and UBI? Thanks for that really short question, Otto. 2 minutes before lunch. Well, I think we'll take that as a comment, and we can pick that up with Otto next time you see him in South Korea, maybe next year. I think we probably need to wrap up and move to lunch, unless, Mark, is yours like a 30-second?
I was just going to say, like, if you continually focus on basic income solving problems, and this is where you end up. You're just a crisis maker. So yeah, I get the justification for when the shit hits the fan, you're going to need money. But if you want to live, you need money, and that's the kind of the potential. Like, I keep hearing about problems with the welfare state. It's like, yeah, I know. But like, I want to live a better life. I don't want to just help, the poorest, which is great. But then everybody else is just doing the same thing every day. Like, I don't know. If you focus too much on solving specific problems, you get tied to specific problems, not to, everybody living a better life.
Yeah, a lot of good points made by everybody, and perhaps we're not all super inspired at this point after this discussion. But I think even if we look at it as an opportunity squandered, that is something interesting. The points that Jane was making about, for a period of time, or Scott was making yesterday, about a radical reduction in child poverty, or suddenly people have almost enough income to live reasonably and to be unimpeded by all the ridiculousness of mutual obligation. And the fact is that there was no political or social movement that coalesced around supporting the continuation of those policies. In our own country, our great ScoMo, the previous Prime Minister Scott Morrison for the international audience, says, we're going to have snapback. We've completely broken with everything we said we believed in through this massive fiscal intervention and the biggest fiscal deficit since the Second World War. But we're going to snap back to punitive welfare at completely inadequate rates. And they did. They weren't lying. And we did nothing to stop it. So it's a powerful political lesson about, you can have this unexpected opportunity, but if there is not the social organisation to support keeping it in place, then that slips through our hands. But let us not let lunch slip through our hands. So thank you.